just wanted to welcome you. We are delighted to welcome you today to this final session of Dialogues on Museum Resilience. Dialogues on Museum Resilience is a program that has been developed in collaboration between We Are Museums and the Museum for the United Nations UN Live since May 2020. The objective was to support the museum field in facing crisis and share knowledge and experiences of resilience from museum professionals who have already learned how to recover. Today is the last session. We had 4 sessions, and this is the 5th and last one. For this last session, we encourage you to make good use of the chat function. You can ask questions, comment on what is being said, network with each other, share links and information, or for any other relevant purposes. This meetup is a space for game-changing conversation between peers, between us. So please keep your webcam turned on to create a safer and more comfortable space for everyone. And it's always nice to see faces. We also ask you to kindly remain muted when not speaking to avoid any accidental disruption or background noises. We are live today and this session is being recorded. It will be posted then on the community with a summary of what has been said today. So for this last session of the Museum Dialogues on Museum Resilience series, we're going to have first a brief summary of the 4 sessions that we had before. Then I will introduce to you the 2 amazing guests, Lindsay McEwen and Christine Alford, who are joining us today, and the question of the day. They will both answer the question, and then we will start a conversation together on the question and on the answers they have given us. So we will start with a brief summary of our 4 last episodes, and this summary will be presented to you by Sandro De Bono, who is a museum thinker and culture strategist and lecturer at the University of Malta. Sandro, over to you for the summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maxime. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on wherever you are. It's great to meet again for this last session. I'd like to say welcome also to Lindsay and to Kristen. Hi, Diane. And on to my synthesis. It's been indeed a long journey of conversations, thoughts, and reflections. We've been moving from Alaska to Aros, from Belgrade to Bogota, from A's to B's, and participants have sought to discover the meaning of resilience through the stories told and the experiences lived. So our first meetup brought Milena Jokanovic, who's also with us today, an associate of the National Museum of Yugoslavia, in conversation with Anne-Sophie Norm, who could not join us today, from UN Live, the Museum for the United Nations. Resilience was explored through the ways and means how memories and trash from the former Republic of Yugoslavia was picked up by contemporary artists of the time to be interpreted anew and transformed into works of art. Milena explained how in Serbia these responses helped communities see the world from a different angle and to look forward to a future. Indeed, resilience can also manifest itself to collections and collecting as we seek to rebuild and bounce forward. Our second meetup brought Julie Decker, the director of the Anchorage Museum in Alaska, in conversation with Milena. The discussion revolved around the social role of museums and the necessary steps that museums need to take in order to stay resilient and to serve local communities. Indeed, the challenges might be much bigger on the periphery. We're talking of Alaska here, but location and relation are always subjective perspectives. Julie shared her thoughts on how to put peripheries at the center in order to spearhead a global response. And in fact, one of the terms that came up in this discussion, which I found very interesting, was the idea of optimistic museology, which is about how we can learn also about resilience on the periphery. Our third meetup then brought Julie Decker in conversation with Cristina Lieras, an independent creator working for the Museum of Bogota in Colombia. The most pivotal role museums have today is to, according to this debate, or what came out of this debate, is to envision the future in addition to reflecting about the past. Construct alternative narratives of the future and offer possibilities, not only catastrophes or not only the negative facet. No museum, regardless of its collections, themes, size, and place, can ignore the upheaval we are living through today. And that too has much to do with resilience. And we also talked about giving up the traditional idea of the use of museum space and to embrace more the need of the community at this point, at this juncture, at this historic point in time. The fourth and last meetup brought Christine Lieras in conversation with Julie Rockher-Bitch, the director of the museum, of the Women's Museum, now is the Gender Museum, if I'm not mistaken, in Arras. The discussion this time revolved around activism and how the museum can make its voice heard. One way, which was also explored by participants, is about looking at the past and material collections that bear testimony to it, then read, talk, and share them in the light of the ever-pressing issues of our times. Julie explained how, in this context, resilience is the result of collective action in the face of crisis. Museums are not neutral, certainly not, and in times of crisis, museums are more relevant than ever. It's not naive, perhaps, to want to change the world. Julie also claimed that. It's naive to think that we can go on in this complex world doing business as usual. Resilience, indeed, is also about having the courage to change course, about not being afraid to be political as well. We're concluding this Thursday today, but I think the journey continues and perhaps might not come to an end. We'll see what's going to come out from our discussion today.
Thank you very much, Sandro, for the summary. And now let's dive into the question of the day. So to answer this question that I will introduce a little bit later, I will start by introducing our two guests, starting with Professor Lindsay McEwen. Thank you for joining us, Lindsay. Lindsay is a professor of environmental management within the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of West of England, Bristol, and director of the Centre for Water, Communities and Resilience. She has successfully led several engaged interdisciplinary UK research and innovation funded projects in water risk management, working at intersection of the natural and social sciences and the art and humanities, and involving multi-stakeholders partnerships. Our second guest is Dr. Christine Alford. It is such an honor to welcome you today, Christine. Christine is a futurist and the director of MOD, the Museum of Discovery at the University of South Australia. Christine leads a team dedicated to creating dynamic, changing exhibitions, showcasing the edge of knowledge and emerging technologies. Prior to this role, Christine was the founding director of foresight agency Bridge 8, facilitating futures and engagement on water sustainability, nanotechnology, health, advanced manufacturing, clean technologies, and climate futures for government, corporates, and not-for-profits. In order to sum up the program, Dialogues on Museum Resilience, we would like to ask our guests to reflect on one final question. And the question is, how can museums play a key role in creating long-term resilience in civil society? Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation to come to be part of this discussion today. I start with a little bit about my background. Over the past 20 years, my research has focused on exploring community resilience through a lens of water at both ends of the extreme, so floods and droughts, mainly in the UK, but also in South Africa. I've run a series of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects funded through the UK Research Councils, bringing together the natural and social sciences and the arts and humanities. They've been on themes like sustainable flood memory, multi-story water, dry, drought risk anew, towards hydro citizenship, and so on. This has involved garnering community narratives, deep mapping, gathering of imagery, as windows into the past and future perceptions of risk and resilience. So we've been exploring the links between individual and community memory, local knowledge and resilience, capturing stories of trauma, denial, deferral of responsibility, but also of responsibility, empowerment and resilience. Emphasis on polyvocality, recognizing different voices. Work has included various narrative forms, including digital stories as a media. And now working capturing young children's voices in the pandemic, a new project VIP Clear, working with Bristol Museums and Archives in the UK. So I have a particular interest in bringing together different knowledges, specialist science, narratives, lay knowledges, to support better local risk decision making. So as a preamble to your question, just reflecting on resilience as a bit of a weasel word, it means very different things to different people. It can mean, from a community resilience point of view, it can mean resistance, bounce back, adaptation, transformation. From resilience as a more static entity in the engineering sense to dynamic, ecological and evolutionary. And resilience can be viewed through a range of different lenses and scales, psychological and cultural resilience, but also that's very different from, say, infrastructural resilience. And there's a strong focus in my area of work around building different forms of community capital, social capital, human capital, environmental capital, and differentiating short-term coping from longer-term adapting and transforming. And here we're talking about the longer term. So if we look at communities are facing increasing challenges, the climate crisis, increased compound risks. So that's the pandemic overlaid with other sorts of risks like flooding, drought, austerity. Alongside living through actual events, communities are living at the nexus of different uncertainties. And the temporal element from a community resilience perspective is important here. It links to what is called the disaster response cycle, involves the disaster disturbance, but also recovery, rehabilitation, mitigation, preparation, as the cycle or the helix perpetuates for increased resilience, ideally, hopefully. And so we've got community within crisis and community beyond crisis. And civil society in its resilience building is navigating a series of dichotomies or axes, including the role of the state versus the role of the citizen, around agonistic pluralism or positive conflict and consensus, contractual engagement versus cooperative engagement, and so on. So returning to the question that was set around how museums can play a key role in creating long-term resilience in society. How can we learn from the cultural resilience of people who've been through adversities in the past to help us in this present moment and to prepare us for deeper crises in the future? I suggest that museums themselves need to be resilient, have a clear strategy for their resilience in the long term, and have a clear sense of and symbiotic relationships with their communities. And I use the plural, it's communities rather than community. There are literatures on resilience in practice. There are literatures on learning for resilience. To be resilient, I suggest that museums might need certain characteristics as organizations and as professionals. But what capacities, attributes, values, worldviews might at-risk communities need from their museums? So I mute some possibilities. I'm coming here from a community resilience perspective. So an institution engaged with its local risk at its place, recognizing compound and systemic senses of risk at a place, ability to look across local risks, vulnerabilities and impacts. Floods are visual, intense, emotive events, but what about recording stories of more hidden and diffuse and pervasive events that are less easy to discern, but potentially as destructive and as costly? How can hidden risk be visualized, materialized and remembered? The challenge of dealing with absences in collections. As a learning institution, having a knowledge of self, aware of its own learning, how it learns, recognizing what significant learning for resilience is, i.e. learning that facilitates change, and valuing different types of local knowledges. Historical processes are fundamental to understanding local vulnerabilities, and communities need the ability to explore their changing relationships between people, communities, and living with risk, both living with risk and through actual events, both in their locale and beyond their locale. And here it's about the importance of formal and social learning through stories with different perceptions, values, and worldviews. So museums also as knowledge institutions, acting as an archive of community knowledge, building and organizing and sharing knowledge, connecting with other sorts of archives, research-led, formal state-led, media-led, citizen-led. The museum as a community embedded institution, knowing its communities, their vulnerabilities, their resilience, working with those communities for shared and negotiated goals. The museum as an inclusive institution with a strong attention to whose voices and objects and artifacts are collected through the museum's activities, recognizing the value of intercultural knowledge exchange, aware of local inequalities and environmental injustices, culturally and emotionally attuned. As a brokering institution, negotiating the tensions in communities, for example, around active remembering and active forgetting. Connaughton articulates 7 types of forgetting, including forgetting for annulment and forgetting as constitutive in the formation of a new identity. These are both relevant for hazard settings that are keen to move on. An adaptive institution, flexible, able to develop but also flip its priorities and activities when situations require it during extreme events and in recovery phases. We've seen that in the flipping on and off of online, offline activities during COVID pandemic, and switching from a focus on past histories to a focus on imagining, visualizing, visioning, scenarioing, as you see in Looking Back from the Future, for example, Future Museum by the artist Jeffro Bryce. There is another. Okay. 3 more. A connected institution, recognizing intercultural lesson learning for local resilience may come from elsewhere, places where conditions in climate projections are already being experienced. Dialogue for anticipatory adaptation. This might involve the opportunity to learn from people who live with risk and challenge routinely, connection with museums in zones of transition, places of liminality, floodplains, coasts, deltas, where heightened uncertainty and rapid change provide opportunities for learning about resilience within and beyond the museum and its boundaries, and indeed community boundaries. Solidarity through networks for resilience. A collaborative institution looking outwards and self-aware of what it does best or could do best, aware of relationships with alike and different, for example, the GLAM sector, NGOs, their community links, thinking about distinctiveness versus hybridity. Strong potential exists to rethink the organizations who are involved in local resilience building. And this involves widening out of risk knowledge centers and building resilience from the statutory agencies that have those responsibilities. Potential connect to museums with resilience education and social learning. And finally, a creative institution linking creative participation in social learning, creative visioning. Managing uncertainty requires creative thinking with room for dreams and fears. In practical terms, it can involve assembling stories and artifacts of the past to inform socially engaged practice. So how do these characteristics that I've muted there influence the ways and ethos of working in relationships and processes with communities and citizens? The one element is a strong sense of co-creation, attention to working with communities and other stakeholders, building up from local participatory processes with a strong focus on what might be described as higher rung Arnstein around participation, delegated power and citizen control, thinking about longitudinal engagements and building trust as critical entities. And the second point is an explicit focus on garnering different voices in museum and community processes, a strong attention to hidden and lesser heard voices. Resilience insights may well be learned from unexpected people and places that have to be resilient. And all this poses questions about the development needs of communities and co-working with museums and museum professionals for increased community and museum resilience. And this represents important exploratory territory for local attuning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Now we are going, yes, Diane, do you want to?
I know, it was just an applause.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Lindsay. We are going now to listen to Christine giving her answer to how can museums play a key role in creating long-term resilience in civil society. I'm wondering if Christine isn't frozen. Yes. All right, so we're just going to wait for Christine to come back. In the meantime, I have a question for you, Lindsay.
Okay.
You talked about creating room for dreams in institutions. Do you have a practical example on how to create that space for dream in an institution that don't have one at the moment?
I don't know. I think about collective visioning is really powerful. We've done a lot of work around storyboarding and using ways of trying to think about. There's a temptation within the current setting to always think in terms of crisis, but also it's really important to try and flip that thinking, I think, to thinking about opportunity, you know, and resilience, and how, you know, within resilience thinking, there's a lot of around the language of survive and thrive, or thinking about ways in which you can flip opportunities. And even within the pandemic, you've seen that particular types of activity have benefited. You know, there's been quite a lot of entrepreneurial activity about how seeing ways of trying to to capitalize on the situation in positive ways, including Zoom, I suspect, has made quite a lot of money.
Absolutely.
I think it is about ongoing conversations and dreams, and just releasing people to think in different ways. Within the DRY project, we have done a lot of what we've called scenarioing work, where we present science, we present the science in accessible ways, and then we try and get people to think about possible futures, you know, the scientific projections. And those aren't all gloomy. You know, they're some of them are quite optimistic about different ways of thinking about relationships with environment, for example, which are quite, you know, creative and exploratory and energizing.
Thank you very much. And as a museum, we can think about a way of presenting these ideas then to the public and giving them power. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It is about empowerment and about dialogue.
All right, so we are still waiting for Christine to join us back. Does anybody has a question for Lindsay on her answer to the question? Yes, Susan.
I really liked your comment about not only the dreaming, but also a space for fear. And this year, fear has been very prevalent. We've all been frightened out of our socks, basically, by our governments and the terrible stuff that's going on. But how do you pair that? How did you bring that together, dreams and fears? That's a very brave notion, bring together.
I think if you're dealing with stories, you know, they are very multifaceted. We've done a lot of work on working with communities around different narrative approaches. And there you get the weave of different elements. And quite often you need to work. I think the element of time is really important here. You need to work through relationships with communities so that you can actually get to a different place and different sorts of conversations. That's happened to me many times, you know, that it is about ongoing conversation. So it is, if you were to speak to people immediately after, for example, they've been flooded, then the narratives you get are very much about blame and denial and trauma and deferral, and often deferral of responsibility. It wasn't, you know, about protection and so on. But actually, once you get beyond that, you start for people to think about more positive ways of adapting, transforming. And that isn't just about physics, it's about a lot of these are around the emotion and the affective domain, you know, thinking about, and the stories that is interesting, stories that travel, we tend to be the parts of stories that travel are often these more intangible elements around positivity and confidence and so on. It's not necessarily about the specifics of adaptations at a place. It's the fact that people can see that people have achieved something, they've done something. So the positivity of the narrative, and also the way that people articulate themselves. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think narrative, you know, I've come into my background, I'm a geographer. Perhaps I should have said that fairly early. But you know, I've sort of bridged the natural and the social sciences as a Scot. I hope you can work that out, possibly Scottish from Dundee. You know, I've had quite an interdisciplinary schooling, secondary schooling, and then gone into, you know, I did a PhD that was more in the physical sciences, but then I moved quite quickly to the interface between the two. And so thinking about scientific evidence and narrative evidence and the different sorts of things that you can gain from how you bring them together seems to be a great opportunity. I use those terms in very sort of sweeping ways, but they are, you know, I think actually just bringing different types of knowledge together as an evidence base for decision making is really powerful. It's tricky territory, but it is quite, because the science, you know, science capital in communities is very variable, and within professions as well. I think Kristen's disappeared.
I think she did. Yes, Sandro.
Yes, I have a question, Lindsay. In the run-up to these to today's conversation, hopefully Kristen will also be joining us soon. You did point out that reading through the 4 sessions sort of sounded familiar or read familiar. You could connect. So in a way, it reflects also. I don't actually remember who am I quoting, but someone said it. No museum is an island. So in a way, we're part of a bigger ecology, of a bigger whole. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's. I mean, I'm saying I was cautious in terms of proposing things or suggesting areas where I think there was synergy, but because I'm not, obviously I've worked with museums, I've worked quite a lot with archives, I've done a lot of archival work as part of my research. But I think, you know, these agendas that are being described here, they weren't unfamiliar to me. In fact, you know, they're residents of the dialogue that's going around in numbers of circles around resilience building in different institutions and the role and the connection between different institutions and their communities, and the fact that actually, you know, you're saying no museum is an art. I think that's a really important point about trying to connect with different institutions. So there is a joined up picture here, because that's what you take. There's lots of people, lots of organizations of different types working on these agendas, but the challenge is both to network those organizations, but also to network beyond those organizations. And I think if we can, so in a community setting, then actually there is some joined up elements, you know, in terms of where the knowledge lies, the relationships with communities and so on, and a sort of collective sense of resilience building, rather than all these different organizations attempting the same agendas, but in isolation. There's a great opportunity there to step change things, I think. Would be my personal view, having worked, you know, with the DRY project, for example, the Drought Risk and New project. We've worked, it was a multi-stakeholder project across a whole series of different thematic areas: agriculture, business, health and well-being, communities, and the public. There were others, there were 6, I can't remember them off the top of my head. But anyway, you know, the thing was the connections between them, you know, the systemic connections, really important in terms of risk and resilience. And just, you know, if the pandemic has taught us nothing else, we live in a highly connected planet, and the connections with all of these things are really important. Health and well-being, actually, in that particular project, surfaced as a really important connecting element between the different sectors that we were looking at. So thinking about that in relation to the museum sector, you know, we're talking, some of these areas that we're talking about are around resilience, about emotional resilience and psychological resilience, that, you know, people have been really challenged in the pandemic in that particular perspective, I think. Not sure if that was a rather rambling answer to your question, but hopefully you got something useful there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very useful. Thank you.
That makes me think a lot about the discussion that we had during one of the meetups with the Anchorage Museum in Alaska with Julie, because it kind of like is a practical implementation of a lot of what you're explaining and saying, and it gives a lot of examples, and they work a lot with local communities, and they create discussions about climate change and about decolonization of Alaska, and it's the fact that they are doing it that it creates resilience, and I think that's very powerful and interesting in relation to what you're saying.
I think that was a really interesting case study about, you know, the museums at the periphery. And this, it comes out in other work we're doing about sort of the liminal zones and places in transition. And also, I think the potential, let's say within the Project DRY that I was talking there, we've been really interested in what's been happening in Australia and California and particularly Southern Europe, about, you know, some of the scenarios, particularly Southern Europe scenarios, when we look at climate change scenarios scenarios for the United Kingdom, they're quite similar to what's playing out at present in, obviously, in Southern Europe. And so actually connecting with areas that already are dealing with some of these issues is really powerful, you know, and connecting through organizations, but also through individuals. And the power of that sort of sense of solidarity is really, really important. And we see it, for example, here, farmers in the UK go out and, you know, they go off on, well, they used to, not now, but go off on visits and find out about, you know, for example, how irrigation and other things are managed in Israel and in Southern Europe, and then come back, you know, and that learning is really important in terms of. So I think that connection between over space and time is really important, that we are connected and we can learn from each other in really positive ways, you know, build bridges.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Susan.
I think that's a very important point. And I think one thing we've learned from COVID-19 is that when the scientific community across the world got themselves together, they produced a vaccine in less than 12 months. That's an amazing accomplishment. And that's sort of proof that collaboration in science or in any area is incredibly powerful. So yeah, I completely agree with that point.
But the other thing, though, is that just to note in that, I mean, that's optimistic, isn't it? But some traditions run really, really deep, you know, in terms of ways of working. And that's about organizational change and about sort of rethinking, you know, it's about organizations, but the individuals in those organizations, because the individuals are really important, you know, because they are the organizations can have a particular strategy or way of working, but actually it's the people that much of the dialogue isn't one-to-one, and that requires people to have a certain perspective, I guess, on communication and positive ways of working and finding ways forward. I say that with science because science can be quite entrenched, you know, at times, and has particular ways of working and sharing and so on.
Yes, absolutely. So we are still waiting on Christine to come back to us. As anybody has a question or a comment to make on what has been said so far? Yes, Milena.
Hello, everyone. Officially, thank you so much for these. I would say inspiring statements, actually, because I felt like really encouraged while you were speaking, and I would go back also to the idea that you said, creating a room for dreams, and then Susan also said that important fears. And for me, it was really important when you said that actually you are coming from the perspective and background which is mixing actually the science and let's say art or all the other like creative perspectives of, for example, museology. What was really important for me, because my PhD actually, maybe I'm now influenced because I'm just publishing a book on it, but it is really turned to the cabinets of wonders as predecessors of museums, but also as those chambers for contemplation, where science and art were actually functioning together, and where they weren't somehow parted. And I think that we are all somehow going back to that idea that we cannot go so much into disciplinary museums, because it cannot help. We are now observing that it cannot help the natural catastrophes, and that actually we cannot somehow exclude science from art. On the other hand, and I would go back also to the, thank you, Sandra, for the introduction and for the topic that I had. Actually, at the beginning of these sessions, we were concentrating more on collectioning, actually, and those collection. And I was referring to some of the contemporary artists who are actually making their own microcosms or cabinets of wonders in the times of crisis. And that room for dreaming and for fear here in ex-Yugoslav parts were actually their walkings and their own personal creations and so on, like creations of their finally works of art, but actually microcosms of their own livings. And that's why I would like to thank you for that stressing of the need of the room for dreams and fears, because I think that we are all expressing that so much personally as museum curators and artistically, but somehow I think it needs to go back to the museum mission itself. Somehow that actually turning back to the and that's why I think it is great that your perspective was from that interdisciplinary, I would say transdisciplinary position.
It's transdisciplinary, yes. And I think you know, when we're talking about different similar journeys of travel, I think, you know, there's sort of, because what you're describing is very similar to what's happening in the university sector as well, you know, about thinking about disciplinary silos and thinking about interdisciplinary working. You know, there's an old saying around disciplinary tribes that have their own sort of ways of communicating and ways of, you know, who's in and who's out. Somebody's just knocking on my door downstairs. That's not very good. Perhaps, do you mind if I just quickly go? It might be a parcel. Can I do that in this Zoom? Or perhaps would you prefer me not to?
It is fine. You
can I just go for 1 minute?
I just want to jump in and respond to you, Milena, about the Cabinet of Curiosity, because that's something I was really interested about a couple of years ago. And there's say that Cabinet of Curiosity was about multidisciplinary, but it was also about bringing the whole world into one room. And this idea, I think the transdisciplinary is something that we need to keep. We need to work with, but the world in one room is something that we shouldn't work with, because it's kind of it was, you know, there's Western people wanted to have everything in their room and at home, and I think it's important to say that we are staying transdisciplinary without being universal.
Sorry about that. That was my postman.
I completely agree with you, Maxim. It's like the instrumentalization of the initial idea, I think, went too much to the Western-oriented perspective of art, science, and the world itself, like a nutshell. But Lindsay, yes, thank you so much. I'm actually coming from the academic background. I'm a researcher, and I'm a researcher at the University of Belgrade. And during my studies, I was always like, somehow said not to dig into the other's fields, you know, because as your art historian, then you shouldn't deal with the modern art if you are dealing with Middle Ages art and so on and so on. But it is so like the methodology was so stiff for me that finally I ended up in museology research sector in order to, you know, somehow find the perspective where you can somehow look transdisciplinary in many different fields actually in the same time. So yes, thank you. You recognized it definitely.
I think there's also, I mean, we're working in other areas with citizens, rethinking the role of the citizen as well, you know, in terms of, because there's a lot of focus on citizen science and focus on that sort of angle of citizen participation, but actually thinking about what that might look like if a citizen researcher in a much more holistic sense that goes through that, you know, a gamut of different types of knowledges, rather than thinking just explicitly around science, which, you know, citizen science has moved from being citizens working with researchers to citizens researching their own environment, but it's still got a very sort of science focus. So how do you actually think about citizens in a different way, and they're citizens as observers, as researchers, as custodians, you know, and different, thinking about the changing role of the citizen and as a sort of, as a what's the right word? Yes, as an observer, learner, custodian. You know, that applies within museum practice, around archives, all that sort of, as a museum, as a citizen as archivist, citizen as museologist. I haven't heard that term before, but.
Thank you very much,
yeah,
Lindsay.
we have it actually. We have also the word the heritologist here in the like I don't know, this part of the world, let's say it like that, because they said it's like museology is you know you do not have schoolology but the pedagogy, you know, and then they give
Yes.
the word which is wider, and then one creation actually museologists nowadays, actually scientists said that actually we shouldn't speak about museology but about heritology as a science. So now it is not the translation of the heritage studies, it is something which is more like it is more explained like a science in some different perspective. But yes, I know that I'm always confusing people with terms which are direct translation to Anglo-Saxonian, actually, where it's yeah, it doesn't exist actually in the literature in English, unfortunately, still.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Thank you very much, Milena. Christine is back with us, so we're gonna give the mic to Christine, the museum, the director of the Museum of Discovery at the University of South Australia, to answer the question that we had at the beginning: how can museums play a key role in creating long-term resilience in civil society?
Hello, and hopefully you can hear me amongst the. I'm trying to be resilient in the face of many computer problems here. We've had some wet weather. It seems to have knocked out my Wi-Fi and the 4G. So hopefully you can hear me okay.
Hear you fine, yeah.
Great, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about, actually not about MOD to start with. I wanted to talk about a program that the state of South Australia ran in the early 2000s called, I think is in Residence program. And as part of that program, the state government would bring international experts in various fields, including justice and urban design and a whole lot of things, to spend some time with the people of the city and to help our professionals in each of those areas learn something new and to swap ideas and to try and innovate some of the systems that we have. And one of the thinkers that they brought over in 2012 to 2013 was Professor Martin Seligman, who is American, former head of the American Psychological Association and known for his work in positive psychology. And the question that his work asked while he was in Adelaide was, can the science of positive psychology be used to prevent mental illness, which affects 1 in 5 Australians? And is it possible to take a public health approach using the science of positive psychology to help improve the mental well-being and resilience of every citizen in South Australia? And so there was a 2-year process that involved, 14 different partners from education and industry and government. Over 14,000 people attended events. And out of that, the Wellbeing and Resilience Institute was created at the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. And so I think for me, when we think about resilience, I'm thinking about resilience in a place that values the well-being and resilience of its citizens, and where we have, if you like, a base level of community literacy around some of the tools that can be used to enhance well-being and resilience. And so the tool that the Think in Residence program really tested and then has tried to push out at scale is known as PERMA Plus. And so PERMA comes from Seligman's work and basically refers to 5 categories that help people become, I guess, more resilient or have better well-being. Those are positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And the plus things that came out of the work in South Australia are really around, physical well-being, so physical activity, nutrition, sleep, and finally optimism, which is a little bit different to sort of the positive emotion, but related. And so when I'm thinking about resilience at our institution, for instance, and I look at those PERMA Plus things, I'll just go through them again: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, and the idea of optimism. I think those are really useful tools for museums and cultural institutions to query and to see how they are perhaps assisting citizens with creating better levels of each of those things. So when we look at the tool of positive emotion, for instance, that it's not just the science of happiness, and I think that we need to be that the idea about positive emotion is a whole range of things, including amusement and hope and interest and compassion and gratitude and a whole range of things. And so I think, you know, and what the research findings show is that things like increased positive emotion can build increased social and psychological resources, leading to better resilience. And I think that positive emotion and engagement with art is something that art museums do every day. And that positive emotion and interest in a historical subject or interest in a scientific subject, again, is something that museums do every day. But to be very intentional about it, to be very intentional about the effect on people, and that positive emotion is something that I think it's useful to query about whether that is embedded into the museum. So, for instance, you know, at MOD, we're trying to help young adults navigate their future. We're not a museum that has a collection. Instead, we build interactive experiences of research and science to help people understand what's just around the corner. And we're really conscious about not bringing in, or not letting, or hoping not letting, I mean, they might, but hoping that people don't leave our museum feeling depressed about the future or feeling you know, down about it. We want them to leave feeling positive, and while they're there, we want them to be positively feeling positive about what they're seeing. And we might play with that along the way. There might be moments of ick or moments of things that are really, really difficult to kind of think about, but ultimately we want to create positive emotion. And then the bit about optimism, I think, is really important from a futures perspective. So if we look at some things around optimism and hope theory, it's important for people not just to have a positive emotion about something, but we also need to provide them with a positive image of what the future might hold, something to aspire towards. And we also need to give people pathways and you know, multiple ways of getting to a solution, and people need to feel they've got agency. So I know Lindsay was talking, you know, about involving the community and communities that we work with, and talking about citizen science, and you know, those types of things where we are putting the agency to create change back in the hands of our community, I think are really, really important for optimism, and having the ability to create change. So again, that's something that we try and do through MOD, is as well as giving a positive image of the future, we're also trying to help young people understand how they can contribute to that and how they can create change. The second component then of PERMA is engagement, you know, which is, you know, that feeling of being in flow, of creative flow, or being completely immersed in something. So again, we're trying to create immersive experiences that allow people just to kind of really get into a topic and delve deeper and deeper and get a level of understanding. So I took a beautiful, we've this week launched our exhibition for 2021. We are enormously privileged in South Australia to be, there is no COVID in the community at the moment. So, you know, while there is still a bit of social distancing, people are meeting, they're mingling, we're able to have events, we're able to open museums, and we're not required to wear masks. So that's kind of a level of activity that's currently going on in the States. So we're able to open our new exhibition. And this morning I took a photo of a visitor sitting in the middle of one of our gallery spaces, just absolutely mesmerized by an interactive that looks at chaos and non-linearity. And she was there for a good 10 minutes just watching it, you know, completely engaged. So, and you all will have examples of visitors being similarly engaged and captured by something and being really immersed in it. And that's a really critical role, I think, of a cultural institution, to engage our communities in something that takes them beyond what they might see elsewhere. The next element is relationships, you know, so having that social network. You know, one of the things for us is that we usually have a very big contingent of international students. Obviously with COVID, we don't have such a big contingent, but we do have international students still here who have now been kind of isolated from their families and their home countries for 12 months. And so trying to create spaces for them where they feel like there is, you know, a sense of community and that they can form relationships with you know, the team we have on the floor, and they can come back and, you know, feel like there's a place to return to, I think is also really critical. The fourth element is meaning. So we need to feel like what we do is valuable and worthwhile. And I know Lindsay talked about, and I know the other topics up to this point have really been focusing on that the museum also needs to be resilient if we're going to create resilience in the community. We have a very strong sense of our purpose and what we're trying to do. So the exhibition that we've launched this week is called It's Complicated, and it's all about illustrating complex systems. And the reason that we developed this exhibition was to scaffold an understanding of complexity for our young adult audience, so that they could have meaningful conversations about things like climate change and like social inequity, and look for alternative points for change, or to understand why some things change fast and some things change slow, to understand how a system might evolve and adapt. And so there's a very strong sense of purpose to that exhibition, a very strong sense of purpose to what we do. And as I said, what we're trying to do is help young people also navigate their futures and giving them that sense of meaning with how they're trying to create their lives. And then the final one is accomplishment or achievement or mastery. And you know, one of the exhibits that we've got at the moment is an exhibit called Custom Made, which has been about 3 years in the making, and it's been made by university students. So MOD is a museum within the University of South Australia, and we had 10 students working on it, 6 engineering students and 4 illustration animation students. It's a work in progress, and we're hoping that we'll have a finished demonstrator of Industry 4.0 concepts by the end of the year. And it's incredibly complicated, and the students have had to really exert a lot of intellectual application, plus sort of some grit under pressure. And there is a real sense of mastery in the work that they have done. So again, that's one of the communities that we're working with, not our public community, that's certainly our student community, in giving that sense of accomplishment. Do we contribute to physical activity, nutrition, and sleep? I mean, not directly. But certainly we have looked at those topics in some of our exhibits, which is kind of within our remit as a science museum, to explore, a whole range of topics. So I think what I really wanted to reflect on was just how useful that scaffolding of PermaPlus to think about well-being is, to then think about building up resilience, because I'm sure I'm not a resilient scholar, but some of the literature I've read would indicate that people are more resilient when they have a good sense of starting well-being, and a good sense of economic well-being, and a good, availability to draw on a range of tools, for instance. So if as a society we're able to increase the well-being of our communities, there is a greater chance that our communities will then be more resilient in the case of crisis and change. And so to summarise, because we are in Adelaide, and because Adelaide is trying to do wellbeing at scale, these things feel very close for us, and they provide a useful tool for thinking about how we can present work within our museum that does actually add to the wellbeing of the people who work with us and who visit us. And I'm hoping this exhibition in particular contributes to several of those things, but mostly to that sense of meaning and understanding. And if there's a year to release an exhibition on complex systems called It's Complicated, I suspect this is the year. So yes, happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your patience with my tech problems.
Thank you very much, Christine, for your answer to the question. Maybe to start the conversation, maybe Lindsay, maybe you have an answer or some comments to make, or anybody, yes.
I think that was a really useful mnemonic, in terms of thinking about well-being in connection with resilience, and seeing how it played out in that particular your setting. I mean, there's no doubt that emotional resilience and psychological resilience are really key elements of overall community resilience. So building up from the level of the individual. There were other things that I just, as you were speaking, I was reflecting. I was trying to remember the organization, but there was a a sort of arts-based organisation in Scotland that did a webinar over in the autumn, and it was focusing on complexity and uncertainty and how you communicate them. And I'm just thinking there's probably potential for some crossover between different types of networks who seem to be doing similar sorts of things, but under different sort of professional, and perhaps in different professional settings. And the other thing I was thinking was about the relationship of your museum to a university, because actually when we talked about in different players in local contexts, then different education settings are really valuable areas for collaboration. There's always, even just from a perspective of students wanting to engage with projects of different types and to stretch themselves in different ways and think, obviously a good example in your setting of interdisciplinary working within a museum setting. That seems to be, because that is actually engaging at that level and at that stage is really powerful, because those students will take that with them, you know, in terms of cascading different knowledges.
Yeah, so it's hard to pick up the cues when to jump in, but
sorry, I'm finished.
No, that's good. No, I think that's actually really interesting, because today we had 70 year 12, you know, final year students through, and part of their final year is they have to do a research project, so a thesis essentially on a topic, and you know it's the first week, but we offered this exhibition to those students as one of those kind of touch points to inspire them about questions that they might want to spend, you know, 6 months, 9 months of their year 12 actually researching. And you know, the level of engagement, because it's so personal to them, was really high. You know, they spent almost 2 hours in the space asking questions and considering things, and you're right, you know, they'll choose something that is important to them to spend time on, but they've had that kind of link back to us as a place that has nurtured that interest, and I think then that's sort of something that might stick for longer than you know, a one-off school visit where you're just having a look at things, for instance. So it was really great to see them through the space and make that deeper connection.
It's I mean, transformative learning is about learners. It's about the facilitators of learners, but also very importantly the settings for learning. And I can see that, you know, what you're describing there could be potentially transformative, you know, for the people involved.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christine, for your answer. Thank you, Lindsay, for your answer first. Does anybody has a comment to make, a question to ask? Now the floor is to all of us. We can comment and discuss together. I thought there was something happening.
I have maybe one question actually, directly related to what you said, Christine, and to what you said as well in a webinar given in the MUTSE program. You actually talked about caring for your staff and learning self-care and caring for the others. We talk about emotional resilience. What I feel now in the museum community is that we found a lot of courage and a lot of strength and a lot of hope at the beginning, and we kept fighting. And I feel that today emotional resilience is really lacking. You started to mention that yeah, we should care for the staff of museums. How can we care more or how can we start caring? Because I feel this is really something crucial today, caring for ourselves and each other. Like within the frame of one museum or within the frame of even this community, actually. Like this emotional resilience is good to teach to or to share to our visitors, but how do we do that for the staff and for us as a community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky when you when the organisation is under stress. You know, so for instance, I think I said at MUSEX, you know, we've faced very significant. You know, we're funded by the university, but obviously the university revenue is down without a large portion of our students coming into the country. So we faced significant budget cuts and lost half our team due to redundancies. And it's really hard to feel like you're caring for people when people are losing their jobs. And I think that's a thing that many museums globally are facing. I guess, I mean, what we've tried to do is it's the relationships part of that Perma Plus. Reaching out, trying to help the people that we've had to let go find alternative work, keeping in touch, making sure that they're part of the continuing network. For instance, for the people who are still here, it's about connecting them with other networks and putting in rituals of care still, so that there are those times to come together and there's those times to sort of, feed the soul. I would say at the moment, my team and I, we are really tired because we've obviously just launched an exhibition, but it took twice as long as it should have to get in, and part of that's because we've had to build things ourselves because we couldn't bring in international suppliers, and part of it's the stress of budget cuts, and part of it's making sure we've got all of our COVID cleaning and all of those sort of systems in place. And there's a lot to do. And I think we just have to, I've just gone through a series of, HR professional development talks with my team. And I've just said, this is not the year to challenge ourselves. This is the year to just bed things down and find a rhythm and be nice to ourselves. And every organisation will be different, but in the cycle of where we are, that's the most important thing, I think, is just to as you said, just to care. So I mean, the way that we're caring is putting those, privileging relationships as being really important, and putting in those physical points to allow for rest. I know that many people were hoping that this year was going to be easier. And it's not. And you can only run so hard, so fast for so long before things start to, really put stress on the system. And so we've got to find a capacity to be able to absorb the stress and process it, and then come back. So that's kind of, I think it's really critical. And it's just, it's so easy to get it's so easy to get caught up in that stress, and that's where if you're not being intentional about the relationships, things fray, because you don't focus on that. You focus on the the physicality of the museum, or the processes, or the outcomes, or any of that sort of stuff. But I think privileging those relationships is really key.
I think also having empathy, that museums are under stress, but communities under stress. Majority of people are feeling some negative impacts of all of this. And so just our Vice Chancellor keeps telling us to be kind. But I hope it's playing out in the institution. But that's the message, and just thinking about that in the way that you communicate with people, and just making space for people is really important, I think, and dialogue. And so, and that's, dialogue within an institution, but dialogue between institutions, because people can be accommodating, can't they, if they have a sense of what's going on, and I suppose giving a window into other institutional functioning and how where the stresses are. You can be, it's really useful to know, in terms of your practice.
Look, I think that idea about spaces is actually, I'm going to think about that again, because one of the things I think I spoke at MUSEX was the idea that, not all resilience is about bouncing back to normal. Some resilience is about bouncing back and adapting to a new situation, and some resilience, shows that we can bounce forward even, and be strengthened by the stresses that have been on us, and actually thrive in a way where we've really grown because of the experiences that we've had. And if we're all hurrying, or I get this feeling of tightening, you know, trying to get back to some kind of normal. We don't allow the space then to adapt to something, you know, in a way that is, you know, that allows for change, and we don't allow ourselves to maybe bounce forward so much. So I think that idea of space is really, really lovely, you know, because it's not like things were great in 2019, and that we didn't need to make huge changes to museum practice or to, you know, the social equity in our communities or to climate. You know, we needed change, and so allowing us to have the space to make some of that change, I think, is really important as well.
In the UK, there was a lot of conversation around, you know, in the first lockdown around the Great Reset, the Grand Reset. And then you know, what's interesting is how quickly people start talking to return to past practices. And it just seems that there's a great opportunity here to rethink things and to, you know, to just take stock. And you're right about bouncing forward, about thinking about things differently. And recognizing, actually, if we're thinking systemically, that certain things can bounce back quite quickly, you know, from deterioration. So, for example, the environment in the UK has bounced back elements of it, water, air pollution, and so on. You know, these elements change quite quickly. So, yeah. So I'm just reflecting, really. But I think it's a real opportunity. You know, it's an opportunity to seize. And the danger is that we just go back to something that actually wasn't the halcyon days of yours that we might have remembering now from lockdown. It was quite different.
I think the challenge in this, and there's we always we want to go back to how it was before, and we glorify how it was before, and there's a challenge in what we're facing now. I think it's kind of accepting that this is the end, and accepting that the future, whatever the future might be, will be different than what we had, and accepting that what we had will never be again. And there's a part of mourning that appears, and I think that there's a challenge in this, in just accepting it as a fact, and and then be positive about what can be built from it. But accepting first that this is the past disappears, and then we have something else coming up. I think there's a challenge. Yes, Sandro.
Yes, this is very interesting. I'm really in a meeting which is really getting us all to think, also through your reflections. Perhaps the shift that we might need to discuss is not about how we're going to engage with the past, but how the future is going to reach us in a way. And I think if we reposition ourselves in the way we relate with our past, but also with our future, might actually help us understand how resilient we can be and how we can engage with our narratives and with the conversations that we need to deal with. And I'm also taking the cue because during this Museo.x webinar, which was given by Kristin Elfert, Kristin, if you remember correctly, you came up with this very, very interesting definition of what resilience is. And you actually defined resilience in a mathematical equation, which is resilience equals disruption and plus protective factors. Perhaps you might wish to take this forward and perhaps tell us more how this equation can actually help us engage with our future.
So can you I'm just trying to come in on video as well so I can see people while I'm holding the phone. Can you just repeat the thing that I'd said? I'd heard the rest of it, but I just missed what the equation, yes, or the phrase was.
Yes, your equation was resilience equals disruption plus protective factors. I might have an image which I can share, but I'm afraid you might not be able to view the visual.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine. I just wasn't sure whether it was that one or the hope one, because I know we were talking about hope theory as well. Yeah, and that came from something that I was reading, which was really, I mean, you don't get resilience unless there is disruption. You know, because without that, there's no need to bounce forward or bounce back to what was there. So I find that comforting, because I think we think of resilience as something like you know, a positive factor. You know, I think of when I think about resilience, I feel like there's a strength there, and it's a thing that is positive. But it only exists because there has been some sort of disruption. And I think that's helpful. And the protective factors are very much the sorts of things that I was talking about in terms of having that level of, you know, engagement and relationships and finding sense of meaning, and that sense of, you know, there's the social structures and, you know, and I know, you know, Lindsay was talking about, you know, the physical waterways, and, you know, all of those physical things as well that can provide those protective factors. But I think it's the fact that you are there dealing with it is the disruption that tests us, that proves us, that does all of that. And so in that way, I find the notion of disruption more welcoming, I suppose. You know, if I think of resilience as positive, then the disruption feels positive as well. I mean, I think the other thing I was just reflecting on is we had in our opening, we had a poem by a young performer, Audrey Mason Hyde, and in Audrey's poem, they were reflecting on there were a couple of words that were just repeated, and those were defiant and tired. And I thought that really summed up how a lot of us are feeling. We feel like fighting, and we have been fighting, and we know that there is a long way to go, and yet we are tired. And one of those is very strong, and one of those feels, you know, like we could be washed away at any minute. And so I don't know. There's something about that disruption which is full of strength and full of and exhausting at the same time. But I think framing it with that equation helps me. I think of it as very much a positive thing to respond to. That the idea of disruption in and of itself doesn't have to be negative. There is a, you know, we wouldn't, you know, for instance, I think I said last year, you know, I had almost 20 casual staff who are floor staff for the museum, and when we closed our doors, and we were closed for 5 months during lockdown last year, would not have had work. And while there were lots of government support around the country for various industries, there was no government support for universities, and so they would have had nothing. So without that disruption, we would never have done an online exhibition. We would have never, you know, changed the dynamic of the team. We would have never done a whole lot of things that now give us enormous flexibility for the sorts of work we might want to do, and a huge skill set that we never would have had. So I think I was thinking about it all in kind of those terms. And the protective factors, again, were things like having a sense of purpose and having good relationships, and that's what helped us get everybody through.
That links to the disaster response cycle. You know, it used to be classically described as a cycle, but now it talks about helices and, you know, about actually getting into a better place through the stress. So it's lots of mirrors of different areas of conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, my background is as a materials engineer, so or a metallurgist. So I just keep thinking about, you know, those transformations when you stress something and you change the structure of it so that you get something else. And I was trying to find a really beautiful example. I mean, you know, obviously diamond is the obvious one, but I think there are many of those where you put something under stress and you change the properties, it becomes different but useful in a different way. So that's kind of also in the back of my head when we're thinking about being under stress, and looking for ways in which that is useful. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Christine and Lindsay, and everyone who participated so far. There's a lot of things in what everybody has said. But if anybody has any more comments to make, please feel free. I put in the chat a book by Sima Rao. I don't know if anybody has read that book in the past, but I haven't. I just had the chance to listen to a talk by Sima Rao last year, and she was mentioning her book. And the book is called Self-Care for Museum Workers. And in her talk, she was saying and talking a lot about not judging ourselves and just accepting that sometimes we feel bad, and that's fine, and accepting that whatever is happening, if we continue to do the work, and if we continue to make things available to the public, to the audience, we are resilient in just doing this. And that she was very positive in saying it gets better with time. But if anybody is interested, I recommend that book. I haven't read it, but she made me want to read it, so could be a good resource.
Well, this is actually really related to what we talked about during the first pilot event that we organized in 2019, Museum Facing Extinction. We had one group actually diving into the concept of a new ethic of care, and the group wanted to say that museums should be stewards with their own local communities. They should start to care for the earth, for the community, for the people, and for the self. This is actually directly inspired by the regenerative culture of Extinction Rebellion. So I just wanted to share with you this small article that we wrote in 2019, gathering ideas of how we could start to care for our staff. Hannah from the Manchester Museum suggested to start with a care audit, like a health check. She also suggested to create some time to go just have a coffee with some visitors, and trying to actually cultivate this flourishing environment and the locality of positiveness and generous approach. So it is a list of different ideas, but I think it's it is a reflection that we have for the past 2 years, 3 years, and very soon I hope we will see more museums actually starting to care for their staff as much as they care for their collections. It's a long process.
Yes, I would just like to thank you again. I said thank you in the chat, but I think this is really important because we are all concentrated always on thinking of the outer spaces and the role of museum in the social and community actual engagement. But it is really important to have that if we're speaking about dream zones, to also have a dream spaces, to have a safe space for us, you know, to deal with it, not to be frustrated with concurrences and with all those, you know. I also feel like that in this community. So, and I feel the role of this community as well, you know, to be somehow innerly connected in order to be capable of acting out the positive change and to be resilient. So thank you so much for raising this, because I think it is important to stress it. Sometimes we ourselves forget about it, I think, during the process.
Yes, thank you very much, Milena. We are approaching the end, but does anybody has any last comment or question?
Just a
Yes.
comment, really, was that I've really welcomed the opportunity to engage with a different group of people around topics that clearly have a lot of connection. So I just think that sort of spirit of those conversations, it would be, I know that this is coming to the end of this sort of dialogue series, but it would be great to think it was a platform for something else.
Yeah, and we are definitely thinking about it. This series is actually part of a bigger circle called Museums Facing Crisis. And these dialogues are actually started in May, but then we also developed so many other meetups with different people, different formats. So this is one part, and then we will go further. We are actually developing the formats and the topics right now. That's why also we are constantly brainstorming.
And thank you from me as well for inviting me to be here. I have found that that connection, you know, with this We Are Museums community really strengthening personally over the last year, to know that there are people here and to be able to check in globally, and to have that you know, that broad perspective, especially when things feel so tight. I think it's a really great way of making the space we just talked about. So I'm very grateful for it. So thank you all very much.
Yes, Sandro.
Yes, I'd just like to share my reaction to this journey. It's been quite a ride, in the sense, I mean, it's been very positive, and we've been around the world in a way, connecting people from peripheries to centers, so on and so forth. What really struck me throughout these 4 meetups is that there is no specific problem, there is no specific challenge. It's a common challenge, because most of the discussion and most of the ideas and most of the ambitions in terms of the hopefulness that we need to embrace was shared by all those who took part, irrespective of whether they're in Paris, in Bogota, in any other part of the world. So, I mean, I always love to mention this. We are all neighbors now. So in a way, we need to really come together more than ever before, as we are already doing, to really be resilient to embrace the future. That's just my thoughts about this journey.
Yes, thank you very much, Sandro. I would like to thank you all for joining us during the whole series, but also today. Just as a last note, I was very happy to participate to this series, and I was very happy to facilitate this session today with you. This has been recorded and will be posted on the community next week with a summary of the session. Please feel free on the community to, if you want to continue the discussion online, to share whatever you have you want to share, and to discuss with whoever you want to discuss. And we are very excited about meeting you in other events in the future. So if anybody has anything to add, we can wrap up just now. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
And have a great day or evening, whenever you are in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Christine.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.